Hello, this is BrucePerens from Berkeley, California, and I'm talking about what comes after open source. So this is a short version of the talk. Your questions may be answered by the full version. It's 60 minutes long, and you can find it at perens.com. There's a lot that's not decided yet. Maybe you can help with that. The successor to open source that I'm thinking about will exist in parallel with open source and free software. It doesn't meet the definition of open source or free software and should never be called either one. It attempts to achieve some goals that open source and free software has failed at. So the initial announcement of GNU was 37 years ago. The two freedoms were announced in 1986. The Debian developers created the Debian Free Software Guidelines 23 years ago. So it's time to evaluate our mission achievement. The good news is open source is everywhere, obviously. There's an astonishingly large body of it. Lots of people get paid to produce it. And open source has replaced the consortium as a means of corporate cooperation. The bad news goes on for a while. But the summary is there are a lot of ways in which open source is broken, and we've really only rationalized about them for a long time. Fixing open source is not the solution. You can't solve the problems without creating a paradigm that works fundamentally differently from open source and free software. The impedance mismatch with business actually drives open source. It primarily follows the goals of business because of the power differential. They have all the money. The result is that open source satisfies business very well, but fails to achieve its other goals. All of the good of open source has never reached the general population, and today they need it more than ever. Do we really help them? Well, they widely use open source, but the general population mostly doesn't know it. And it's often used in service of their exploitation through devices and services that have the business function of collecting espionage about the user or even manipulating them. It's not the general population's fault for not using open source. Yes, our software would be more respectful of their rights, but it's not their fault for not choosing us. It's our fault for not serving their needs. Open source has a begging problem. The developers write the software that keeps the entire technical world running. For this, anyone else would be highly compensated. But the open source developers are supplicants. They have to beg. So this is begging. Please give me a job in your exploitive company so that I can be paid for writing open source. Please sponsor me on Patreon. Hear that one a lot, don't you? We're represented by powerful companies, not us. Look at this list. A lot of people who have different interests than the open source developers. It's like loggers claiming to represent the trees. The Qualcomm guy on the list fights the open source initiative to prevent royalty-free standards at Etsy, the standards organization. That's just one example of differing interests behind the leadership of the Linux Foundation. A new problem, API copyrights. The jury in Oracle versus Google found 4 API copyrights. No case has overturned that yet. The old guidelines that said APIs were not copyrightable have been replaced in modern court cases. Software patents are still a problem. The patent quality improvements that open source won in the USA in the early 2000s have been reversed. So what do? We have Open Innovation Network, which unfortunately exists as much to protect the software patenting system from open source driven reform as it does to protect Linux from software patents. So who controls the Open Innovation Network? Google, IBM, NEC, Philips, Sony, Toyota, some of the biggest patent holders in the world. SUSE doesn't even belong on the list. Their interest is in protecting the patent system that provides them revenue from open source driven reform. Compliance is a mess. There was no design for license compliance in the open source paradigm. As a result, it's expensive to carry out and dissuades business users who would try. I've been there. I've consulted for so many of these companies, and it's big and slow and expensive and confusing. License violations can't be prosecuted. If you're going to have a license that makes any kind of significant requirements, you need to be able to enforce it. That means sue your infringers. Otherwise, you should just put all of your software in the public domain, because that will be the effect anyway. Open source and free software developers can't afford to sue infringers. There are too many licenses. Most of the new ones don't add enough value to offset the combinatorial cost. Many of them are favorable toward the company where they were written. They're not in favor of the open source developer community at all. And we're going in the wrong direction on that. The current open source initiative board policy is to become a comprehensive source of open source licenses. That means to adopt very many more. Whose interest is that in? So let's make something new instead. After 37 years, it might be possible for us to learn from our mistakes. Hey, this is really ambitious, might not succeed, but it would be worse if we didn't try. So let's set some goals. The first should be preserve open source. I have an idea for that. We should commit to grant the open source developers all of the advantages of our new paradigm as well, and support them to continue to allow their software to be used under an open source license. Preserve open source. The most important requirement here is stability. So my idea is form a new open source promoter. It's called Coherent Open Source. The website is licenseuse.org. It's just in its infancy. It preserves the open source definition in its present form. It promotes a minimal set of only 3 licenses with important characteristics. And it doesn't change. The only future change will be updates of those 3 licenses, so it doesn't need a committee to govern it. The Coherent licenses are all approved by both OSI and Free Software Foundation. They're all compatible with each other. Each has a clause regarding software patenting. Each fits a different business purpose. 2 of the 3 ask a little more of industry than some companies are comfortable with today, because we should push that line. So the Coherent license set is 3 licenses that have different business purposes, and you can satisfy most business purposes with these 3. And they are Apache 2.0, LGPL3, and Affero GPL3. And if you've read them, you'll notice that LGPL3 and Affero GPL3 actually share a lot of text. So you really only have to learn 2.5 licenses. Okay, so let's get to moving forward. Moving forward, we attempt to create a new paradigm, because attempts to fix open source will only break it worse by abandoning its present guarantees of freedom and non-discrimination. And that's already in progress. So one of the goals should be no central committee. The minimum organization necessary to produce one license and one operating agreement and evangelize them is all that needs to be formed. The operating agreement is enforced by developers working together, not any central committee. The goal here is to minimize self-sustaining bureaucracy. Hey, look, in 30 years of doing this, I know I don't want to administer or operate companies. I hate doing that. I want to develop software. One of the goals should be freedom, of course. Preserve the freedom to have the source code for your software and to use, modify, and redistribute the software for any purpose. But recognize that the freedom of the general population of human beings is the freedom that we're working for. We are not mainly here to give corporations more freedom. Differentiate freedom and zero cost. Free as in freedom and charging for some uses already live together with dual licensing in open source. Companies that don't want to share modifications can pay. Let's take that paradigm and expand it. We will do it all with one license. Fix the impedance mismatch between free and business, and we do that by charging for some business use cases, and in turn, we make compliance much easier than it is today. Send one payment processor a check once a year for all of the post-open source software in a charged use case in your company. Make determining what you pay easy. If you pay, you can combine with proprietary software. That's compliance. It's going to be easier, even cheaper for very many companies. And most use cases remain free. Pay the developers. Developers should not be supplicants and have to beg in order to have the right to do their development and feed their families. They should have a means to prosecute infringers and the financial means to represent themselves rather than be represented by industry stand-ins. Apportionment. Gee, is that a word you've never heard? It's taking one payment and splitting it up among various payees. There needs to be a technical way to figure out how to apportion income among developers. This depends on everyone using Git correctly so that work is attributed. There are special cases that we have to watch out for. Goal, serve the general population. We've, in general, written software to scratch our own itch. So we mostly write code for coders just like us to use. We've not had any strong incentive to serve the general population of differently technical human beings around us. They're not non-technical. Some of them are genetic engineers. Obviously, some projects and developers choose to do this anyway. Better incentives might help. Getting paid is a good incentive to better meet the needs of the general population. Software that some businesses pay for will always be available for individuals for free, and most business use cases for free. Developers will still write what they want to write, but I think they'll be better motivated. Reduce complexity. One license and one operational agreement among the developers. Users don't have to concern themselves with the operational agreement. Compliance is built into the paradigm. Goal. Don't read a license if you don't have to. The vast majority of individual users never will. The reasons for you to read a license are you modify or combine the software, you sell it, you offer software as a service, you sell devices, you offer support. If you don't do any of those things, you don't have to read a license. If you have a no-charge use case, you publish all modified source code. Usually people can do this through one of the Git sites, GitHub, GitLab, etc. We would also have our payment processor offer that as a free service. It closes an exploited GPL loophole. Publishing is much better than just giving the source code to people that you give the binary. Also convey the license in the statement of origin, just like we do with open source today. If you want to combine with proprietary software and keep the result private, that is a paid use case. We need to have a patent and API copyright-free zone, and we do that by saying in our contract that if you bring a patent or API copyright suit regarding any software under the post-open source license, all of your licenses terminate. Implementation detail, use contract law. It's gotta be a contract. Users without charged use cases consent passively. Users with charged business use cases consent actively online through one of our payment processors. So what are the charged use cases? Inclusion in a product that produces a revenue payment for its sale or direct use. So that's embedded devices, software licensed for income, software performed as a service that produces income for the service itself, whatever the service is. So if you have a web server, use it to sell widgets, that doesn't get charged. If you have a web server that performs a service that's paid for, that does get charged. Inclusion means all components under the post-open source license. So that could be libraries, your operating system, your database. This does not depend on linking, probably depends on the boundary of one physical computer, but that's something we can work on setting. Charged use cases. Number 2, support vended by parties that are not substantially the copyright holders of the supported work. Red Hat Enterprise Linux, I'm looking at you. We can restrict support because our agreement is a contract and you can't exercise any copyright rights at all, not even reading it without joining it. Specific requirement in this for notification of security information to the developers on a timely basis. Everyone has to do that. That is unfortunately a currently exploited loophole with Red Hat Enterprise Linux. They have a gated community of security information. If you spread that to people who haven't paid, you lose access to it. We don't want that to go on any longer. So, charge use cases. Number 3, combination with proprietary software. Whether it's internal or external, it's given a blanket license for the company based on its size, paid annually, no other compliance necessary, and you can subtract what you pay for other use cases. So if you're already paying for software as a service, you may not pay anything for this. There is a dual licensing choice clause that is for the benefit of open source developers. If they dual license with our post-open source license and an open source license, the license choice has to be the post-open source license. That gets them paid. Those are all of the charge use cases. Everything else is no charge. All individual use cases are free. Most business use cases are free. If you don't combine with proprietary software, you don't sell the software, you don't offer the software as a service or support for a fee, and you don't make embedded devices, you will never need to read the license. You'll never need to pay anything. So should we be ethical? There are a number of ethical licenses. I created one sort of as a joke or a test called the vaccine license. It requires that you get your shots. They're all well-intended. They make you feel good, but they wouldn't work in a court. So sorry. So, how do you comply with a charge use case? You share a small portion of revenue, has to be revenue, not profit, because profit is too easy to state creatively. I worked for movie studios, they were very good at never making a profit. There's a very simple scanning process just to recognize what releases of what projects who are using and what percentage of the product software we make up. You figure out a percentage, you fill in a statement, you send payment to a payment processor that handles apportionment among the developers. You do this once a year. Compliance for charge use case is number 2, so no requirement to distribute source code or license text if you pay. Submit to audit if required, but there are limits meant to protect you from abusive behavior. So what are the fees and rules? Not yet decided, and I'll need your help. Intended to be mostly unchanged after creation. The rules for upgrading the license and operating agreement, not yet determined, but the main intent is to avoid bureaucracy. A paid or non-pay user can stay with an old version of the rules and charges forever if they stick with the old software. So you will always know what you're paying. The operational agreement establishes payment processors, their duties and income, provides for apportionment of payment to developers, requires that developers are diligent in preserving attribution of work that they incorporate so that people are paid fairly, establishes technical standards for carrying this out. Enforcement: any developer who signs the operating agreement can sue on behalf of every developer, but the agreement limits how they sue. There's a 90-day grace period. You get treble damages plus legal fees for persistent non-payment. You can let a complaint out to a law firm on contingency. This works best because it's done on behalf of all the developers, so the fees can be larger than otherwise. It's not intended to be a moneymaker for developers. It makes the enforcement enough of a threat that developers will usually get paid. Will anyone go for this? I don't know. It's for the good of developers, so I think there's a chance. Whether business users come on board mostly has to do with the size of the community and the quality of the code. Did we really think business would jump on open source the way they did? No. So we have the power. Developers have the power simply because of our numbers and our productivity. We need to harness that power for the good of the general population and for our own good. And this will take belief in ourselves to get started, bravery and tenaciousness to build. Where do I go from here? I'm still begging. I could use sponsorship to continue work on this, and I need legal resources. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. Let's go to question and answer now. So I'll read the first question here on the. We have quite some questions, so let's try to be effective. So the first question is, how would your proposition solve the problem of free software being used by large enterprises and systems designed to track and spy on people?
Um, Unfortunately, I don't believe that the so-called ethical licenses can be enforced in court. So the first answer is that I don't believe that provisioning your license to prevent that kind of use would work. What would work would be providing a competing product for the user to use. And open source has totally failed at that so far. Obviously, people go to the Apple store for their phones. They use the Android telephone if they're not going to the Apple store, etc. We have completely failed at providing the user with end user solutions that they actually want to use. And So what I'm trying to do here is provide the open source developers with more motivation to make compelling end user software for people that does not do that kind of spying. Obviously, there are a lot of open questions. Whether this will work economically, um, all up in the air. We won't know until we do it. I'd be happy to discuss this with you further if you have any ideas about it. A lot of getting from here to actually having a working program is going to be talking with other developers. Go on.
Okay,
You're
next
on mute.
question. Why is the regular non-affero GPL in the list of licenses?
I'm sorry, repeat that.
Why is the non-affero GPL in the list of licenses?
Why isn't the non-Affero GPL
Yeah.
slide rather than the Affero GPL? Well, the idea of coherent open source licensing was to have a minimal set of licenses. So given the choice of applying the GPL or the Affero GPL, the Affero GPL has a provision that allows you to get source code if the source code is performed. And that is directed against all of the software as a service companies, which would perform highly modified software and never distribute it. So the GPL, as it stands, would not get the modifications, would not get the source code for those modifications. The Affero license would. Now, if you're using the Affero GPL3 for something that isn't software as a service, its effect is the same as GPL3. So I think it was a win to just choose Affero GPL3 instead of saying, well, let's have 4 licenses. Let's have Apache, LGPL, GPL, and Affero GPL. There wasn't really a reason to have both GPL and Affero GPL.
Okay. Next one is statically linked languages are growing in popularity. Is the standard LGPL the desired option, or the LGPL with static linking exception?
Well, I think that the legal issues here have changed because of the acceptance of API copyrights, at least in the United States so far. It used to be that dynamic linking was arguably legally different from static linking. I'm not sure it actually ever was. We didn't have really good cases about it. The only cases we had were mostly about video game cartridges and their plugging into the video game. So one of the important changes that I'm making here is the post-open source license does not depend on linking. It depends on combination, because there are things like object brokers, etc., that combine software in ways that nobody ever thought of when GPL2 was written. So as far as LGPL3 and the static linking exception, it's actually kind of antique. And one of the things that we're doing with Coherent open source is we're saying, okay, this is the best we can do with open source, and let's go to a new paradigm where we don't have to argue about linking anymore. And that's the best answer I've been able to come up with so far.
All right. The next one is a bit long, but I'll try my best.
Okay.
Your goal is to be able to pay maintainers and developers. This sadly comes at the cost of having increased responsibilities. If someone pays for something, they expect it to work. To me, this takes out the fun of writing free software. Would post open source only be a commercial space with no hobbyists?
Well, it's still the same decline warranties as today. And the idea there is you are using the post-open source software in your business. You have made the decisions about whether it is fit to use. And the open source developer is not responsible to come rescue you if their software breaks in some way that you did not expect. We're charging a relatively small percentage for this software. We aren't charging for full service. Full service is something you can offer. You can offer it for your own software. You can offer it for all of the post-open source software if you pay a small percentage of what you make from that to other developers. And so if you feel that I fund it or you as an open source developer, if you had to use it or don't offer service, a lot of else to do, but there will be people who are willing to fix your software for money. Next question.
Yes. What about OpenSSF? Should we leave Linux and migrate to OpenBSD or something?
I don't feel that the operating system will last forever. I think we're kind of reaching at a usefulness Unix paradigm, and we're seeing that with other ugly fixes paradigm like FISB, which we were at possession and dependency management among us. I think there will be other operating things that the system will be open license, and that their developers will in many cases actually use.
Yeah, I think we have some audio glitch.
I hope they can hear me.
Yeah, it seems everyone is getting some garbled audio. Let's try going on.
Okay.
So next question is, for non-programmers, artists, etc., who use Creative Commons instead, what license would fit your model?
I'm not I'm not attempting to solve all the problems in the world. So I have not tried to solve a problem for performance art, for literary publications, etc. We have seen the open source licenses applied to these things. It's conceivable that we could see the post-open source license apply to things that we don't really expect. I haven't.
I think we lost Bruce. Bing, are you there? Yes, he's coming back.
Yes, I
Yeah, I think we lost you for you have to unmute yourself.
I think we lost Bruce. He got disconnected from me too.
Okay, let me try reloading then.
I think it's an issue with the system, maybe.
Yeah, okay, Bruce, do you hear me? Yeah. I don't hear you. You are muted.
I'm muted.
Yeah, now it's
It's okay.
It's okay. Yeah. You were saying? Yeah, we lost you on Creative Commons.
So I haven't really thought about works other than software works at this time, and I'm not sure that's really for me to solve. Literary works, performance art videos, conceivably could be put under the post open source license, but I'm not sure it really works for them. I'd be happy to discuss that more. Next question, please.
Yes. You say you don't want this new organization to become a large bureaucracy, but looking at SBI and Conservancy, accounting has been a very large burden and takes a lot of resources. How would this org not waste tons of money on accounting and financial services, especially at the scale you are talking about?
Okay, so my idea was to create payment processors. Payment processors are for-profit companies. There's more than one of them. They receive payments and they distribute them to the developers. So the accounting is their use. They get a percentage of the money that they handle to pay for that. And I thought it was important that they not be a monopoly. So I put in the provision for there to be more than one payment processor. They have to sign the operating agreement, but they can be independent of each other.
So your idea is to provide the definitions and the rules and then let third-party payment processors handle the actual business?
Well, I think that I would probably help some companies start one. There's a chicken and egg problem otherwise. You really have to come out of the gate with a way to get paid.
Right. Okay. Next question. Won't this collapse under the detail of dealing with both very small corporations through to the huge ones, plus the different ways to store source, not just GitHub, and then linking developers' IDs across multiple platforms to their apportionment?
Yes, so there are issues of, well, you receive lots and lots of checks. Each of the checks says what post-open source projects are being used. The granularity is usually project. And so you really have to sum all of those up and decide how to apportion the payments to developers. It doesn't actually sound that complicated. To me, it sounds like something you could figure out with a spreadsheet, or, a software program for that is eminently possible. And the point also here is by creating payment processors, they can compete to give good service and thus to be recommended by the projects as their preferred payment processor. Although you can use any one, they can optimize their own performance. You get a fixed amount. Whether you make a profit or not depends on how efficiently you operate. So I'm not considering that this is a burden that the payment processors could not handle. As far as how you account for who wrote what, it really depends on it. I can't make it work for every revision control system in the world, and that potentially presents some projects with technical problems. But remember, this is the decision that you're making for your project to start issuing it under this post-open source license. And your revision control system might have to change when you make that decision if it's not Git at this time. There's nothing sinister about this. It's just that I know a company that does account for developers using Git. They're called Merico, MERI.co. I have to make a disclaimer. I own something less than 1% of that company through another company that makes investments. Probably not important, because I don't think that people want to use commercial software to do this. I think they want to create post-open source software to do this particular task. But that company, Americo.co, gave me some of the ideas for accounting for developers. Go on.
Right, and how do you see the projects we have today transitioning to this model? Like from the small projects, small web applications, or even medium to large applications to the scale of a project like Debian?
So existing software projects would dual license. And that means that they would continue to issue their software as open source. They'd also post open source license. If you combine that with software that's only under a post open source license, you have to use a post open source license on both pieces. So you get paid. The issue of Debian is actually a special one. Debian would have to work through a compilation copyright. And the idea there is that Debian does not necessarily own a copyright to the software and its distribution. For the most part, it does not. But the work that Debian has done to combine all that software into a working system is under a compilation copyright, a separate copyright from the software. And that would be a special charge use case. So if you had something like Ubuntu that was paid for, I don't actually know anyone who's paid for Ubuntu, but if you had something that was paid for, Debian would potentially receive income from that.
Okay, so next question. You say you don't want to support corporations. You mean monopolies or large profitable ones, right? But I do not see any detail here that does not favor large enterprise entities. Just an easy throw money solution they love. Also, technical solutions to legal economic problems don't work. A committee-less project means there is no real life, real people, democratic or other governance structure beyond the power provided by throwing money.
So this is actually dealing with the problem of having two communities. We have a community that wants to share software, and we have a community that really doesn't want to share software. And what do you do with that community? Well, we have tried for at least 22 years to sort of force that community into sharing software, and it has worked uneasily. I go and consult companies all of the time, and the reality is that most companies, big or small, are vastly incorporating open source software into their products and are not complying with the licenses. I've been paid for consulting where the end decision of the company was, well, you know, we should comply, but it's just going to be too expensive. So we're not going to do this. We'll design our next product so it doesn't need compliance. It's really discouraging to walk away from a company that has decided that open source license compliance just isn't worthwhile. It happens. So what I'm attempting to do here is make things fit better than they do today. As far as saying technical solutions to legal problems don't work, you could also say that legal solutions to technical problems don't work. Both of those statements are much too broad. The open source licenses in the open source paradigm has actually been a really great legal solution to a legal, technical, and operational problem. If you remember 30 years ago, companies used to get together and have consortia so that they could develop software together. They don't anymore. They use open source. So we have solved this sort of problems legally. I think we're at the end of our time.
Okay. Do we have any more time for questions, Director? I don't think so, right?
I don't think so. No, I think it's
Yeah,
pretty
so Thank you, Bruce. I think there's a lot of discussion that comes from this, and I hope you good luck with the future of this project.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.